What if black blades were never the highest form of swordsmanship in One Piece? For decades, Oda has been slowly building one of the strangest mysteries surrounding Zoro. We know that a sword can permanently become black. We know that Ryuma somehow transformed Shusui into a black blade over the course of his life, and Mihawk carries Yoru, one of only 2 confirmed black blades we have ever seen. But despite everything Zoro learned in Wano, Oda still refused to tell us exactly how a black blade is created. And I think there is a reason for that, because the final evolution of Zoro's swords may not simply be turning all 3 of them black. In fact, I think Oda may have shown us the opposite transformation hundreds of chapters ago. A blade that does not become black. A blade that becomes white. And if this theory is correct, Zoro will eventually accomplish something that neither Mihawk, Oden, nor even the legendary Sword God Ryuma has ever been confirmed to achieve. One of his swords will become a black blade, another will become what I believe is a white blade, and together they will represent the 2 opposing sides of swordsmanship that Zoro has been learning since he was a child. The ability to cut absolutely anything, and the ability to cut absolutely nothing. And strangely enough, the biggest clue to all of this may have been sitting in Zoro's mouth since the beginning of the story. Wado Ichimonji. Before we go further, big thanks to my friend Mr. Bushido for this crazy theory, and let's start right away. So to understand why, we first have to go all the way back to one of the most important lessons Zoro has ever received. During his fight against Mr. One in Alabasta, Zoro is faced with a problem that brute strength cannot solve. Dazbones has turned his entire body into steel, and no matter how hard Zoro attacks him, he cannot cut through it. That is when Zoro remembers something Koshiro taught him years earlier. Zoro had heard stories about swordsmen capable of cutting steel, and asked his master whether a swordsman could really reach a point where he could cut anything. But Koshiro's answer was completely different from what Zoro expected. He demonstrated his lesson by swinging his sword at a piece of paper without cutting it. A truly great swordsman does not simply cut everything in front of him. He cuts only what he intends to cut. And this lesson becomes the key that allows Zoro to cut steel for the first time. Think about how strange that is. Zoro's breakthrough toward greater destructive power did not come from learning how to destroy more. It came from learning how not to destroy. The lesson that allowed him to cut steel was first demonstrated by failing to cut paper, and that contradiction may contain the entire secret of One Piece swordsmanship. Because what if these are actually the 2 final directions a sword can take? One path leads toward absolute cutting power, the black blade, and the other leads toward absolute control over what is allowed to be cut, the white blade. We already know that black blades are extraordinarily rare. Shusui was not originally black. It became a black blade through Ryuma's battles, and the transformation increased the blade's strength and durability. Mihawk's Yoru is also permanently black, yet despite countless legendary swordsmen throughout history, these remain the only 2 confirmed black blades we know. That alone tells us something important. Whatever creates a black blade cannot simply be powerful armament hockey. If that were all it took, the world should be full of them. Roger wielded a sword. Whitebeard wielded a supreme grade weapon. Oden possessed monstrous hockey. There have been generations of powerful warriors, yet permanent black blades remain almost impossibly rare. So there has to be something more, and Wano may have quietly given us the missing piece. When Zoro struggles with Enma during his battle against King, he remembers the swordsmith Shimotsuki Kozaburo, the man who forged Enma. Kozaburo explains something that changes how we should look at every sword in the series. Powerful swords have personalities. A sword is not evil simply because people call it cursed. According to Kozaburo's philosophy, a sword that others fear may simply be fulfilling the purpose for which it was created, while weak swordsmen blame the weapon because they cannot control it. And suddenly, Enma makes sense. Enma is not randomly attacking Zoro. Enma is testing him. It demands an enormous amount from the person trying to wield it, drawing out Zoro's haki so aggressively that his arm can visibly wither when he loses control. Oden could wield Enma because Oden was strong enough to satisfy it. Zoro's breakthrough comes when he stops trying to suppress the sword and finally gives it what it wants. And this is where the theory becomes much more interesting, because Shimotsuki Kozaburo did not only create Enma, he created Wado Ichimonji as well, the sword Zoro has carried longer than any other, the sword that belonged to Kuina, the sword representing the promise that created Zoro's entire dream. And yet these 2 blades could not appear more different. Enma is aggressive, demanding, dangerous. It pulls enormous amounts of haki from its wielder and forces Zoro toward greater greater and greater power. Even its name evokes the ruler of hell. Wado Ichimonji, meanwhile, is almost unnaturally calm. Its name is commonly interpreted around the idea of a straight path or straight line of harmony. And just think about that for a second. Zoro has spent almost the entire story carrying a sword whose name invokes a straight path and harmony, while being one of the most directionally challenged human beings alive. This man can be shown the correct path and somehow still travel in the opposite direction. In Enies Lobby, everyone can be heading toward the same destination, and Zoro will find a way to disappear. In Dressrosa, he can literally have someone giving him directions and still wander away. It has always been one of Zoro's funniest running jokes, but Oda loves hiding meaning inside jokes. So what if Zoro getting lost is not magically caused by Wado Ichimonji? We don't need to go that far, but symbolically represents Zoro's relationship with the sword. He carries the path of harmony, but he has not yet found harmony, and there may be a reason for that. Wado was never originally Zoro's sword. It belonged to Kuina. After her death, Zoro inherited it, along with the promise that the two of them had made. One of them would become the greatest swordsman in the world. Ever since that moment, Zoro has treated Wado with enormous respect. But respect is not necessarily the same thing as understanding. Zoro can use Wado because he is an extraordinary swordsman. He can pour hockey into it. He can perform his strongest techniques with it. But what if he still has not completely understood the philosophy represented by the sword? Because look at young Zoro. His dream was incredibly simple. Become stronger, never lose. Defeat the strongest swordsman. Stand at the top. That ambition is still part of him today, but Zoro himself has changed. The man who once lived entirely for his own ambition was eventually willing to throw his dream away for Luffy. At Thriller Bark, he was prepared to sacrifice his life. After Sabaody, he swallowed his pride and bowed his head to Mihawk, the very man he had sworn to defeat, because becoming stronger for his captain had become more important than his own pride. Little by little, Zoro has been moving toward Koshiro's original lesson. A sword is not great because of everything it can destroy. A great swordsman knows what he wants to protect. And that is exactly why Wado Ichimonji could represent something beyond the black blade. Imagine that a permanent black blade is created when the nature of the swordsman and the nature of the sword become completely synchronized around the will to cut. Then its opposite should also exist. A subscured whose control becomes so absolute that this principle permanently changes the blade itself. Not a sword incapable of fighting, not some magical weapon that can never hurt anyone, but a sword that perfectly embodies Koshiro's lesson. A sword that cuts only what its master intends to cut. A white blade. And suddenly, another character becomes much more important. Tashigi. When Tashigi was introduced in Logtown, Oda gave her a bizarrely specific dream. She loves famous swords, but she does not simply want to own them. She wants to take famous blades away from criminals and evil people because she believes these swords do not belong in their hands. Her entire philosophy treats swords almost like beings that deserve the correct owner. At the time, this sounded like Tashigi simply being obsessed with swords. But after Wano, that idea feels completely different. Because now we know that swords can have individual characteristics. We know swords can test their wielders. We know supposedly cursed blades may simply be misunderstood. And we know that the relationship between swordsman and sword is much deeper than simply owning a sharp piece of metal. Tashigi's philosophy may therefore have been foreshadowing an entire side of swordsmanship that Zoro still has to understand. She looks at a sword and asks, who should this blade belong to? Zoro usually looks at a sword and asks, can I master it? Those are two completely different relationships with a weapon, and I think before Zoro's journey ends, those ideas are going to collide. But there is another swordsman who may have already come incredibly close to discovering this balance, Kozuki Oden. Oden carried two legendary swords, Enma and Ame no Habakiri. And here, we need to make an important distinction. Contrary to something that is sometimes repeated, these swords were not created by the same swordsmith. Enma was created by Shimotsuki Kozaburo, while Ame no Habakiri was forged by Kozuki Sukiyaki. But symbolically, their pairing is almost impossible to ignore. Ame no Habakiri is described as capable of slicing through the heavens, while Enma is described as capable of cutting through the bottom of hell. Heaven and hell. Oden carried both. And despite his absurd strength, neither is known to have permanently become a Black Blade. That should bother us. Oden was strong enough to scar Kaido. He possessed extraordinary haki. He could wield Enma naturally when almost everyone else would have their haki drained out of them. So why didn't Enma become black? Perhaps strength was never the missing ingredient. Maybe Oden had mastered how to wield both swords without ever completely becoming one with either philosophy. Enma pulled toward destruction. Ame no Habakiri represented heaven. Oden stood between them. He balanced them. But balance alone did not permanently transform either blade. And that brings us back to Zoro, because Zoro is now carrying an even stranger combination. Enma and Wado Ichimonji. Hell, and harmony. And unlike Oden's swords, these two blades actually share the same creator. Shimotsuki Kozaburo created both of them. What if that was intentional? What if Kozaburo created two masterpieces representing two opposite answers to the same question? What is the perfect sword? Enma's answer is power. Give me everything. Pour your haki into me. Do not hold back. Cut. Wado's answer may be control. Know yourself. Know your purpose. Protect what must be protected. Cut only what needs to be cut. And Zoro's ultimate challenge will not be choosing between them. It will be mastering both. This would also completely change the meaning of his final confrontation with Mihawk. Mihawk represents the summit Zoro has been climbing toward since the beginning of the story. And Mihawk carries Yoru, a black blade. The ultimate visual representation of the path of the swordsman Zoro originally wanted to become. Powerful enough to defeat anyone, a swordsman standing alone at the top. But if Zoro simply turns Wado black and defeats Mihawk, then his final achievement is essentially reaching the same destination. He becomes another Mihawk, another master with another black blade. But Zoro's story should end with him surpassing Mihawk, and perhaps surpassing even Ryuma. Ryuma is remembered as the sword god, and Shusui became a permanent black blade through his battles. So imagine the final revelation. Enma becomes the sword that can cut anything. Wado becomes the sword that does not cut what Zoro wishes to protect. Black and white, yin and yang. And Zoro stands in the middle. That could be the real meaning behind Three Sword Style at the end of the series. Conqueror's haki can overwhelm another person's spirit. Swords can carry the intentions of their wielders. So if Koshiro's ultimate principle is deciding exactly what should and should not be cut, perhaps the highest form of that ability does not merely distinguish between steel, stone, flesh, or paper. Maybe a master swordsman can choose what aspect of something he cuts. That part is much more speculative. But it would explain why a white blade could be even rarer than a black blade. You would need enough strength to cut anything, and enough mastery to choose nothing. Which brings us all the way back to the piece of paper. Maybe Koshiro was never teaching little Zoro a minor technique. Maybe Oda showed us the ending of Zoro's swordsmanship before Zoro even entered the Grand Line. A swordsman who can cut nothing can cut anything. Enma turns black. Wado turns white. For the first time, one swordsman possesses both extremes, and Zoro will finally have achieved something beyond becoming the world's greatest swordsman. He will have surpassed Mihawk's black blade. He will have gone beyond Ryuma, the legendary sword god. He will have mastered heaven and hell, destruction and protection, ambition and loyalty. And maybe that is how Zoro fulfills the promise he made at Kuina's grave, that his name would become so great that even she would hear it in heaven. Not simply as the strongest swordsman of his generation, but as the swordsman who completed swordsmanship itself, the man who mastered the black blade, and created the first white blade.